about a more, science-oriented version? I launched into a highly abbreviated explanation of replication. When I was done, Auric and Frida looked equal parts confused and appalled.
"That's not the same,"
Frida exclaimed.
"That's just a copy of you."
"But if original you isn't around anymore, it sure beats the alternative," I replied with a grin. Teresa laughed.
"And to anyone else it might make no difference. If a copy of me loved to chase my grandchildren around and remembered everyone's birthdays, how would you tell it wasn't original me? But it wouldn't be."
There's a postulate in information theory that information can't be destroyed, I said slowly. I was sticking my neck out. I knew it. I watched myself doing it and couldn't stop. This might be well beyond what Quinlan's had managed to retain. And in philosophy, there's something called a closest continuer, which, according to some thought, actually would be you, even if there was a gap. Teresa gave me a quizzical look.
"I can get the definition of closest continua from context, but I'd love to hear more about this bit, about information theory."
There were groans from the others. It appeared advanced physics was not a popular subject. I was in my VR library studying some of the blueprints of Heaven's River produced from scans by the Skippies and Gamers when I received an alert from my Manny's AMI. Sentry Roamer reports disturbance. That meant someone or something was disturbing my trunk. I quickly entered my Manny and climbed quietly to my feet. It was full night, and Ted was on watch. The ersatz starlight was enough to illuminate the shore if we got too close, but it generally wasn't a problem, as the current and wind tended to keep the boat in the middle of the river. Ted would wake us up if some emergency navigation became necessary. Meanwhile, we had a small lantern on bow and stern, just enough to mark our position for any other boats, but not enough to affect night-adapted eyes. Of course, that didn't matter for a Manny equipped with real night vision. Someone had peeled back part of the tarp and was bent over the trunks. Someone with a, shall we say, extra-wide silhouette? I walked quietly up behind Snidely and whispered, "It's locked, asshole." He jerked up and turned to face me.
"Very well locked, it would seem. Better than mine, which appears to be the same quality."
Huh. He just out and out admitted he was trying to break into my trunk. Probably a punchline of some kind was coming. "Is there a point, Snidely, other than that you're a thief?" He smirked back at me.
"Well, Enoki, I happened to be watching when we pulled into Beetlejuice. It was very impressive how you managed to get them to not inspect your trunk."
I frowned. How so? They didn't inspect either trunk.
"But I ordered them not to inspect mine. You tricked them into thinking I had two trunks."
I didn't do anything except pull off the tarp, Snidely. They made an assumption. Should I have begged them to please open my trunk? I notice you didn't volunteer.
"Very glib, Enoki. Tell you what, since it's all so innocent, why don't you open your trunk for me?"
"You first."
"My trunk," he said haughtily, "is not under suspicion."
"Neither is mine, dumbass. Meanwhile, I found you trying to break into my property, which gives me the right to defend it. So here's the thing." I stepped up until my beak was right up against his. "If I catch you trying that or anything similar again, I will rip off your head and shit down your neck. We clear?" Snidely stepped back, clearly not prepared for the level of implied violence I was projecting.
"I will tell the captain you threatened me."
"I will tell the captain you are a thief. I wonder which one of us will be tossed off the boat." He glared for a few more seconds, then turned and stalked off. But I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 17. Trolling for treasure. Bill, August 2334, Vert, Pits of Payback. The troll lay at my feet, sliced in two, the halves neatly cauterized. I cleaned my sword carefully and resheathed it. I'd gotten the flame blade and some enchanted armor in exchange for the staff of fireballs and most of my portion of Garg's hoard. It had been a fair trade in that both myself and Saruman the Wise claimed we'd been fleeced. Still, neither of us backed out of the deal. Our dungeon party was currently creeping along a dark hallway in the pits of Payback. When asked about the name, the current DM would only smile mysteriously and say that all would be made clear at the conclusion of the campaign, which probably meant a bad pun or something was in our future. Kevin was back, as his original character, having left behind just enough identifiable pieces to allow a resurrection. Gandalf had used one of his scrolls after taking all of Kevin's remaining worldly goods in payment. Kevin seemed to have finally gotten over the loss of his staff, thankfully. I hadn't been subjected to any more glares, at least. Tim, who hadn't left anything but floating ash, was back as a first-level thief. He was staying in the center of the group until he leveled up enough to not be killed by an inadvertent sneeze. Vern, Pete, and I provided the muscle and sharp implements. So far, we'd been able to handle the encounters, but the increasing difficulty sent a pretty clear message that we were getting close to the payoff. Gandalf strode along just behind me, acting like king of the mountain. I hoped his talents matched up to his attitude. He was remarkably close-mouthed about his actual abilities and assets. "That was a troll," Tim said, unnecessarily. We turned to look at him. "And?" Vern said. "Pretty hefty monster for this level of dungeon," Tim answered. "If not for Bill's flame blade, I'm not sure we'd have been able to take it down. Not without losing another player or two, anyway." I looked back in the direction of the troll carcass. Tim was right. I'd gotten too used to being able to cleave just about anything with one swipe, but trolls were, generally speaking, more than a handful. "Are you suggesting we're being set up?" Gandalf asked. "Anyone made any enemies lately?" I glanced at Kevin, who gazed back at me innocently. That was a long shot anyway. If Kevin was that sensitive about losing treasure, he'd never make it as a gamer. Everyone else was looking around at everything and nothing as they considered their own recent pasts. "There's a secret door here." We all turned to Tim's comment. He was poking at a random section of wall. "You sure?" "It's about the only thing I'm good for," Tim replied. "Why do you think I picked this character class?" "Fair enough," I said. "Let's see if we can crack this." We all started poking, twisting, pushing, lifting, and pulling every protuberance in the area. A few seconds later, a door opened with the typical stone-grinding sound effect, revealing a pitch-black tunnel. "That looks dark," Tim said, "and cramped." He pulled a copper piece out of a pocket and tossed it into the blackness. There was a dull thump, followed by a metallic tinkle. Yeah, something's in there. Anyone got a light spell? Or a flashlight?" We needn't have bothered. Whether we woke it up with the coin toss or it simply decided it had lost the element of surprise, the demon hound charged out of the tunnel straight at Vern. He, a battle-hardened, fearless half-dwarf warlord, went rigid with fear. Seriously, the hound knocked him over like hitting an inflatable Bozo the Clown. Apparently, the hound had been expecting more resistance than Bozo had been able to deliver. It continued on in its trajectory, speed unabated, and fetched up against the far wall with a loud thump. The hound made an oddly human oof noise and slid down the wall to land in a heap. Pete, who hadn't gone rigid, took the opportunity to impale the beast before it could get up. As the light went out of the hound's eyes, Pete smiled and said, "About time I got a good kill." The second demon hound hit him at neck height, taking his head clean off. "Shit!" his head said as it bounced along the floor. I finally unfroze, pulled my sword, and parted the hound cleanly. "Well, that's suboptimal," Gandalf said. He grabbed Pete's head by the helmet crest and lifted it until they were face to face. "No resurrections, buddy, even if you could afford it. I used my last scroll for Kevin." Pete's head said, "Yeah, okay, I was getting tired of this character anyway." The conversation was interrupted by a heavy bass growl ahead of us in the hallway. "What the blinkin' blue blazes was that?" Kevin whispered. Tim replied, Dunno, but it had a certain quality of bigness to it. And hungriness, I added. Tim peered into the tunnel. I think we're being herded. But it's this or go straight back. I kind of wish you still had that staff, Bill. I shook my head in reply. Firing it off in that cramped space would as likely as not cook all of us with the blowback. Gandalf, you got anything for close order fighting?
Not like what you mean, Bill. I think your flame blade is our best hope.
Wonderful. This meant I would be going first, holding my magic sword out in front of me in hopes of killing an attacker before it could get to us, which would do diddly squat against a magical attack. My future began to truncate in front of me. I shrugged and edged carefully into the tunnel. Someone want to shed some light on this? Gandalf muttered something and a light shone over my shoulder, illuminating the tunnel ahead. The tunnel wasn't high enough for us to stand straight, so we were forced to move forward, bent at the waist. If I'd been bio and doing this in real, I would have had back spasms within a minute or two, but in the spirit of classic D&D, the game engine allowed us to overlook some of the more realistic aspects of adventuring. The tunnel eventually terminated in a blank wall. We all turned to Tim, who shrugged. I don't see anything.
I'm getting tired of this campaign, Vern muttered. We've been battling high-level beasts since almost the entrance, lost over half our group, and we have sweet diddly to show for it. Hopefully the final payday is worth it.
Gandalf checked through his satchel.
I have a spell of true seeing in here somewhere. Ah.
He pulled out a small notebook and paged through it. A few seconds of nodding and muttering, and he looked up.
Let's try this.
Gandalf made some gestures and spoke in an arcane tongue. He then squinted and peered intently around, checking the blank wall and the tunnel wall around it.
Nothing. What the hell?
We all stared at the blank wall. Red herrings were one thing, but dead ends generally needed to have a point. I'm really starting to hate this DM, Tim said, and turned around to head back up the tunnel. He took 3 steps, then said, Really, really, really hate. We looked past him at the blank wall where a tunnel used to be. We were now in a section of tunnel about 20 feet long, blocked at both ends. I frowned. Gandalf, is your true-seeing spell still active?
Yes, for another minute or so.
See anything in this tunnel we should know about?
Nope.
What blocks or counters a true seeing?
Higher level magic, of course, but I'd sense that.
Tim, you see anything significant? No, and a true seeing would pick it. Hold on. Tim put his hand near a section of wall. There's a draft here. We moved over to it and each took a turn feeling for the slight airflow.
On the list of things that defeat a true seeing, Gandalf opined, we can add low-tech tricks like building a wall without mortar.
He pushed on the section of wall and it gave a little. We all put our backs into it, and after a few seconds of resistance, the wall collapsed outward. The good news is that it crushed several of the zombies who were waiting on the other side. The bad news is that it alerted all of their still uncrushed brethren. We were at one end of a large subterranean hall with a ceiling so high it was lost in the gloom. Torches lined the walls, giving enough light to illuminate dozens of zombies milling around the chamber, and a large, nondescript statue at least 20 feet tall standing at the center. "Oh, shit," Tim exclaimed and backpedaled frantically.
"Brains,"
said the zombies and advanced on us.
"Now hold on," Vern exclaimed. "That's entirely the wrong kind of—" "Shut up, Vern," Gandalf growled. "Kill now, carp later."
I raised my sword and started swinging, perhaps a little too enthusiastically as Vern yelled, "Hey, watch it!" and danced out of the way. Without Pete, we were down to 2 fighter characters. Even with magical accessories, Vern and I wouldn't be able to hold off a bunch of undead. "If you've got anything in that bag of tricks, Gandalf, now would be the time," I yelled.
"Give me a sec,"
he yelled back. I could hear muttered curses, then,
"Aha!"
There was a pop, and a zombie that was trying to eat Vern's axe turned into a cloud of smelly gas. My eyebrows went up, but I didn't have time to think about it. Zombies weren't particularly powerful opponents, but they made up for it with sheer numbers and a total lack of fear. and they were very hard to kill. You generally had to reduce them to sushi before they'd stop coming at you, and I had at least a dozen of the critters about to step into range. I cocked my sword arm and pop, pop, pop. Woohoo! Gandalf yelled. The sudden disappearance of several zombies gave me time for a quick glance over my shoulder. Gandalf was gesturing with a wand. Each time he pointed it, there was another pop. Damn, that's handy, Vern said and chopped another couple of zombies. Bibbidi-boppidi-boo, Gandalf replied, dancing around and waving his wand. Bibbidi-boppidi, bibbidi-boppidi, pibbidi-bobbidi-boo. With each downbeat, another zombie went up in smoke. The odor was verging on overpowering, and the game engine wouldn't let me turn down my olfactory sense. We were down to the last dregs of the zombies, and I was beginning to think we might survive this when a huge hand reached out of nowhere and wrapped around me. I found myself hoisted into the air, unable to draw a breath. The last few zombies disappeared with popping sounds, and Gandalf stopped the song and dance routine. Strangely, I don't think anyone had noticed my predicament until that moment, judging from the shocked expressions. "Little help?" I managed to squeak. "Hello, Wabbit," a voice said from behind us. Vern and Gandalf turned. I couldn't move, but the huge hand helpfully rotated me to face the voice to find Kevin, grinning at me, holding a scroll. "Golem," he explained, waving the scroll. The helpful hand turned me around again, and I was finally able to see what I'd previously assumed was a statue. A 20-foot-tall, clay-colored humanoid shape stared back at me impassively, with a face surprisingly reminiscent of Odo from DS9. It loosened its grip slightly so that I could more easily breathe and talk. Kevin put the scroll into a pocket, and I reflexively struggled. No joy, of course. He didn't have to hold the scroll to control the golem, just possess it. And golems, besides being almost indestructible, were hella strong. Kevin walked a little ways to the side to put some distance between himself and the rest of the group, still smirking triumphantly but not saying anything. It looked like he was going to wait for us to ask the first question. "What's going on, Kevin?" Vern asked obligingly. Kevin gestured at me. "Bill here. First time in a campaign, he goes from dragon fodder to a level above me by basically tripping over himself. Does practically nothing and comes out golden. Plus, I took your staff of fireballs. I'm sure that figures into it." Kevin glared at me. "You needed to be taken down a peg, bud." He directed a nasty grin my way. "So I set up this campaign and made sure you were invited." "You played and DM'd?" Gandalf exclaimed. "No, I've got a friend running the show. I'm just what you might call a backstabber," Vern finished for him. "Whatever. None of you have anything that can take out a golem. Enjoy your deaths, courtesy of Bill. And speaking of Bill," Kevin raised a hand and made a squeezing motion. I waited for the end, hoping the sensory feedback filter was set way high, but nothing happened. Kevin got a perplexed look on his face and repeated the motion. Still nothing. Kevin reached into his pocket, and the concerned expression changed to panic. "Looking for this?" We all turned to Tim's voice. He was leaning up against the wall, casually flipping a scroll in his hand. "Oh yeah, that's right. Thief." "You truly are an asshole, Kevin," Tim said and opened his other hand. The golem dropped me, then reached out, grabbed Kevin around the head, and squeezed. There was a pop sound, not the least bit like a zombie exploding, and squishy juice squirted from the top of the golem's fist. Vern bent over and retched. "Oh, God!" Gandalf exclaimed. "Did you have to do that?" Tim grimaced in sympathy. "Okay, maybe not my best move. However," he held up the golem scroll, "I appear to be in possession of one kick-ass piece of magic. I feel some leveling up in my future. Let's see what else we can find." We grinned at each other. Another successful campaign. I'd invited myself over to Gandalf's VR again, and he was eyeing me suspiciously. Maybe he was expecting another lecture on the gamer's involvement in the expedition, but that wasn't what I was worried about this time. So, about Kevin. That's not Bob-like behavior. How far has he drifted, anyway? Gandalf shrugged. He's actually one of my descendants. I could ask him, but off the cuff I'd say he's about 24th generation, so it shouldn't be a surprise that he's drifted a lot. Bit of an asshole. A vindictive one at that. Yeah. Listen, Bill. I get why the whole drift thing bothers the senior Bobs, but you need to appreciate that from our point of view, it's more upside than otherwise. Well, that was interesting. I raised my eyebrows and made a rolling motion with a hand for him to continue. When we first started the Gamers Group, most of us were still mostly Bob-like, and frankly it was a little boring. Everyone wanted to be a magic user. The dungeons tended to all feature intellectual puzzles. Everything was carefully balanced, all very civilized. Now, Gandalf made a helpless gesture. Nowadays, you can't always depend on your fellow players. Sometimes crazy shit happens, like today, and sometimes things go wildly out of control. Campaigns are way more fun these days. Also, we are now getting non-Bob replicants joining up from some of the post-life replicant arcologies. What? Seriously? Who? No one today. This was all Bob's, but a couple of guys from your last time out were ex-human. Interesting that you didn't notice. Huh. Well, he had a point. So, Kevin is going to suffer a loss of reputation, but not so much for the attempted backstabbing as for failing at it. We'll still let him join campaigns. We just won't let him stand behind us, if you know what I mean. I chuckled and shook my head. You're right. It's too easy to get myopic and see everything from the point of view of my own priorities. And that's going to become an increasingly dangerous habit. I think I have to make an effort to start seeing everyone as individuals. I stood. Thanks, Gandalf, for the game and for the lesson. He was still smiling when I popped out. 18. Trouble with Snidely. Bob, August 2334, Nirvana River System. It was kind of a good news, better news thing. The good news was that Snidely was now avoiding me. The better news was that everyone else had noticed and was actively hanging around me. I wondered why I hadn't thought of this tactic when I was alive. We were on our lunch break and were once again sitting around the fish bowl, by which I mean bowl of fish. Yum! We'd gotten onto the concept of morality, and Frida had just asked Teresa how she could have any sense of morality without a deity to define what was or was not moral. And as usual, I was having to grit my teeth to avoid doing a facepalm, which wasn't a Quinlan expression. They didn't seem to have a direct equivalent either, or I'd have used it by now.
What deities give you aren't rules of morality, Teresa responded. They're just rules. Do this and you'll be rewarded. Do that and you'll be punished. That's how we teach our pets not to relieve themselves in the house. One would hope that true morality involved more than learning not to poop on the rug by being rapped on the nose.
I remembered that small animal Garfield had seen wearing the cone of shame. It seemed pet behavior was another universal.
In fact, Teresa continued, I believe that it is only possible to acquire true morality without input from a deity. It is only when you do something because you believe it is the right thing to do, instead of because of any moral deserts, that you are acting morally. Likewise, it is only when you refuse to do something because of the golden rule, rather than because of a threat of punishment, that you are behaving in a moral manner.
Ah, I piped up. The golden rule, treat others as you'd like to be treated. Teresa gave me a perplexed look.
No, that's the silver rule.
What? Had I missed something?
There are 3 rules of behavior,
Teresa replied, now in lecture mode.
The iron rule: treat others less powerful than you however you like. The silver rule, treat others as you'd like to be treated. The golden rule, treat others as they'd like to be treated.
Huh. I had not heard that. Teresa frowned at me.
Seems like an odd gap. How far away is your home? Maybe they need a missionary visit. From an atheist?
Frida said archly. Wait. I gestured at Frida with an upheld hand, then to Teresa. How is that better?
If I treat you how I want to be treated, I'm not taking into account your desires.
Teresa made an imploring gesture.
If you are a unitist and can't eat land meat, but land meat is my favorite, the silver rule says I'm behaving morally by offering you a steak if you're hungry. But of course you won't eat it, and in fact may be offended. So the silver rule is still to a large extent about me and my desires. However, with the golden rule, I am obligated to take into account your beliefs and preferences when deciding how best to behave toward you. Does this not produce a better result?
Huh, I said. Again, not sounding very smart, Bob. I'll have to think about that. Teresa smiled.
That's the best sentence any teacher could hear. But,
Frida interjected,
you could believe literally anything, and there's no way to decide which is right. Shall we just sail right past port, then?
Captain Lisa's voice washed over us. Damn, she had presence. I wondered if captains practiced that kind of yelling.
Maybe we should just sail into the rocks, then. Perhaps when you have a few seconds, you could steer this mother-bedamned tub.
Once again, lunch 10 minutes was over. We pulled into Orchard Hill without incident. As soon as the gangplank was in place, Snidely stalked down it and away, cutting in front of the captain. He wasn't carrying his trunk, so unfortunately he'd probably be back, and Captain Lisa would likely have a few things to say to him. The captain and the dockmaster got into the usual spitting and shouting match, which, as usual, terminated with "Work for us." We began hauling boxes off the Hurricane and stacking them on a low-slung cart specifically designed for this. It was mindless work and allowed me to think. I'd been on the move for a week and had traversed a segment. Assuming that was a reasonable speed, I'd be a month and a half getting to Garrick's Spine. Maybe a little more, since I'd also have to move from the Nirvana back to the Arcadia. Maybe I could get on a boat that crossed as part of their regular route. I was interrupted in my ruminations by something undefinable. There's a particular sound, or maybe a change to the normal background that happens when cops show up. It's subtle, but it's enough to make you stop and look. Coming down the dock was Snidely, talking animatedly to one of 4 cops. I doubted that he was trying to get them to check the Hurricane's boating license, assuming they had such things. Snidely marched straight up to me and with triumph in his voice said, "This one." The cop, presumably the ranking officer, examined me, head slightly cocked.
"Doesn't match the description,"
he sighed.
"Nevertheless, we're here."
He motioned me to precede him up the gangplank.
"What's going on?"
Captain Lisa demanded. She placed herself in front of the spokes cop, blocking his path. He gestured to Snidely.
"This gentleman has accused this man of being the fugitive who is currently being sought through several segments."
"Based on the fact that he tried to break into my trunk and I threatened him," I said.
"And why would he be trying to break into your trunk?"
"You've known him for 5 minutes. Tell me honestly if that doesn't seem in character." The cop said nothing, but his face took on the stony cast that meant someone was trying to suppress a facial expression. After a moment, he sighed.
"Nevertheless, we're here, and Mr. Whiplash is from a family."
He turned to the captain.
"You can refuse to let me on board, but the dockmaster can also refuse to continue to load and unload. Your choice."
Captain Lisa gave Snidely a murderous glare before replying to the sergeant.
You have permission. He does not.
She turned to Ted.
Bring Mr. Whiplash's trunk down.
Snidely smiled at her.
Big deal. I'll have another ride by the end of the day.
But it won't be with us, the captain replied. And the shipping community is small and tight-knit. Don't be too sure of your options.
She pulled her vest pocket open and rummaged for a moment, producing 2 coins.
Here's the balance of your fare.
She threw the coins to the ground at Snidely's feet. I'll give Snidely credit, he ignored the coins. He also dealt her a glare that made her previous salvo look like a love fest. If people had started shooting lightning bolts from their eyes, it wouldn't have surprised me. The coins rolled a short distance, and a couple of spectators pounced on them. The sergeant gave Captain Lisa a look that might have been sympathy, then turned back to me and gestured again to the plank. We passed Ted on his way back, carrying Snidely's trunk. A brief glance assured me that he hadn't gotten the wrong one. The tarp had been stripped back and left off. I pulled my trunk from the pile, placed it flat, and unlocked it. The cop reached forward and opened the lid to reveal stuff. A folded vest, some small tools, several books, a miniature ceramic figure, and a diary and writing implements. He pushed a few items around, frowned, then frowned at me.
This is just common goods. Why did you not just show him this?
Would you have if that pompous ass demanded it of you? The cop snorted.
No, not likely. I think Mr. Whiplash is going to have some explaining to do. Wasting the constabulary's time is not without consequence. My apologies for the trouble.
I smiled and nodded, and the cops marched back to the dock. I imagined a sharp and hopefully not short conversation in Snidely's future. I glanced at the shipping container that currently held Bender's Matrix instead of these random items. I'd have to swap things back tonight, as that particular container was destined for the next stop.
What a putz,
Ted said. I grinned and pushed the fishbowl toward him. Yeah, but did you see the look on his face as they marched him up the dock? I think he's going to have an interesting afternoon. Teresa accepted a fillet from Belinda and chewed thoughtfully on it for a few seconds.
Sadly, he will probably have many children.
We all chuckled. Harvey, our new deckhand, said,
It sounds like I missed an interesting time. I've had to deal with obnoxious passengers before. Never fun.
Teresa turned to me.
So, Enoki, tell me more about utilitarianism.
There were groans from the others. It turned out that dislike for moral philosophy transcended species. Frida was holding the night watch again. That helped, as I'd spent time last night working out her routine. Now I had to switch back the contents of my trunk and the shipping container, but, night vision. I had both containers open and had moved the miscellaneous items back into the shipping box. I held up Bender's Matrix and was about to place it carefully in the organics that formed my trunk's padding, when a voice behind me said,
That's very pretty. What is it?
I whirled, almost fumbling the Matrix, to find Teresa smiling at me. I said.
It is about the size of a funerary box, and since you took steps to hide it, I have to assume some level of guilt, if that's the right word.
Well, this was just peachy beyond belief. Would I have to kill Teresa? Could I even do that? What were my alternatives?
You're not from around here, are you, Enoki?
None of us are, Teresa. She laughed.
You know what I mean. You're not a native Quinlan, at least not a resident of Heaven's River, like the rest of us. Are you even a Quinlan at all?
What an odd question. What else would I be?
Well, You'd be someone who knows about things like utilitarianism and closest continuous, which I'd never heard of, but not about the 3 rules which every child learns. And you're someone who thinks the gravity in Heaven's River is 0.86 G instead of 1 G. Where are you from, that the gravity is 1.16 G?
Oh, bugger. I remembered that conversation. I'd assumed the translator would convert my statement, but apparently not. Well, that was just a huge, steaming, smelly pile of... I think you're reading too much into an unconnected series of conversations, Teresa.
That would be a reasonable proposal, except for the thing in your hands. It appears to be metal. If it is, it's enough metal to buy the entire segment. But you're working as a deckhand. One of these things is not like the other. Know what I mean?
She smiled at the last sentence. Teresa rolled her eyes.
You're usually a bit more articulate than that, Inoki. Do you need a slap?
I chortled. No, thanks, Teach. So what are you going to do?
If I tried to call you out, would I survive?
I closed my eyes briefly. That would be the most effective way of dealing with the problem, and from a strictly utilitarian point of view, it might even pass muster, but no. I don't work that way. I'd just run. And I'd have to take a chance on getting this wet. I held up the matrix to illustrate.
So, you are the person they're looking for?
I'm pretty sure. There's always a possibility of coincidence, but I'm going to guess that's unlikely, and even if that turned out to be the case, I'd still end up in the pokey until they straightened it all out.
What are you guilty of?
Trying to rescue a friend. Seriously, Teresa, that's all I'm doing. She nodded.
I believe you. I may be biased, but I don't see someone being able to understand moral philosophy without being guided by it. Besides, you're very interesting to talk to.
I laughed softly and muttered, "Dance, monkey, dance."
What?
Oh, it's an ironic statement where I'm from. It means I have to continue to be entertaining in order to preserve my safety.
I hope you won't view me that way, Inoki.
She smiled sadly.
I see no reason to expose you. Tell me this, though. Is wherever you're from outside of Heaven's River? Or at least outside of what the rest of us live in?
I hesitated, then decided to go for it. Yes, Teresa. And you're right, I'm not Quinlan. There is an administrator, but they aren't a deity, just an engineering construct, and they're after me because they want this back. I gestured with the matrix again.
Is it theirs?
I shook my head. No. In fact, I literally, personally built this item myself. The administrator took it from me, then the resistance took it from them, and now I'm trying to take it back. That is enormously simplified and leaves out a lot of detail, but it is the truth. She smiled and nodded.
Thank you for telling me. I will miss our discussions.
What? Why?
Because no doubt you'll be leaving without notice at the first opportunity. Good night, Inoki.
And with that, she turned and headed back to where her granddaughter was curled up. I was shaken. As I finished securing the matrix and placed my spider back into the trunk, I had plenty of time to consider my options. Granted, of all the people to discover me, she was probably the best option, but however I parsed it, I was exposed. And she was right. The safest move might be for me to leave straight away. 90 miles, more or less. That was the surface distance between rivers. I briefly considered doing an overland hike to the next river, but that was just too far. 5 days hiking, and that was if nothing went wrong. And again, I couldn't use streams or tributaries.
Teresa and Frida were at it again, theistic versus atheistic morality. I'd heard it all so many times before, mostly when I was still alive, that it was hard to stay interested. Teresa glanced at me from time to time, but made no effort to draw me into the conversation. Ulrich, however, had no reservations.
Inoki, what in Father's name is wrong with you? Run out of things to talk about?
I have things on my mind, Ulrich. Sorry, I'll get over myself soon. Teresa smiled at me.
It's okay. It's not like we're on a schedule.
I opened my mouth to reply just as the captain started her daily tirade about sloppy, lazy, do-nothing deckhands. Turned out we were on a schedule.
We'll be turning around at the end of this segment,
Ted said during a rest break.
You still planning on continuing east?
Yep, as far as I know, they haven't moved my home city.
Teresa and Belinda are getting off at Misty Falls. That's our last stop before turnaround. I guess you'll all be getting off together.
I thought about that for a moment, but I couldn't see how it affected my level of risk. Teresa wasn't any more likely to suddenly loudly denounce me just because she was on land. Still, once I was on another boat among a whole new set of strangers, I'd feel a lot better. By midday, we were approaching the Misty Falls docks. I couldn't account for the fact that I felt more sadness than a sense of dread or danger, until I realized that I would never see Teresa again. She'd become very much a friend over a surprisingly short time. However, I had no choice. It wasn't even a case of getting away. The hurricane was turning around to head along the Paradise River. Docking was the usual chaotic jumble of yelled orders and flying ropes, and then we were moored. At that point, Captain Lisa came over to say goodbye to Teresa, Belinda, and me. They'd have enough deckhands with Harvey, who was staying on, but no passengers for the return trip. I hoped they'd still be able to turn a profit. I picked up my trunk and followed Belinda and Teresa down the gangplank, not particularly paying attention. Which I guess explained my surprise when we walked out into a circle of cops. 19. Recall is a thing. Howard, August 2334, Trantor. I sat back and put my hands behind my head, grinning like a fool.
You have that smug look,
Bridget said.
What happened?
Well, it turns out we're not the only replicants with money and influence. I waved a hand at the email displayed on the canvas. Senator McIntosh, remember him? Loudly anti-replicant? He's being recalled.
Really?
They got the required signatures, and guess who was behind the recall campaign?
Us?
I laughed. No, although I would have loved to have a hand in it. The man is a toxic dump of xenophobia and undirected hate. It's possible he didn't realize that the Afterlife Replicant Reserve is part of his district. Or maybe he thought he could remove our rights before they could fight back, or something. Bridget frowned.
That would be a couple hundred signatures at most. They'd need...
Bridget's eyes lost focus for a moment.
Something like 15,000 to succeed.
Yep. Turns out, though, that people are concerned about their afterlife. Afterlives? Anyway, the anti-McIntosh group started comparing him to Faith in terms of removing replicant rights, then implied that no matter what kind of post-life setup someone chose, he'd be after them sooner or later. I guess it's different when you're personally threatened. Bridget snorted and sat down beside me. She spent a few seconds paging through the news items before turning to face me.
Still, he hasn't actually been voted out yet. Let's not count our politicians before they're properly cooked. And the overall problem is still there, mistrust of replicants.
Which is why I've started a rumor that someone is working on Manny's for the living. It's not exactly spilling the beans. For instance, I didn't share any information about exactly who is doing this or how far along they are. But the point is that if humans think they can have a Manny while they're still alive, a full ban will be a hard sell. Bridget smiled noncommittally, then pulled up a new window.
I have an exploration candidate.
I peered at the information on the surface. Is this new?
Just discovered. Mario and his crew are still searching for others' nests.
They haven't found any, but naturally they're exploring new systems in the process. They've found a few more planets that were hit by the others, and some other planets that hadn't been yet, but probably would have been soon enough. This particular one is... well, just read it. I reached across her and paged down through the summary. I could feel a frown forming on my face, then deepening as I continued to read. Is this for real? Unless Mario has suddenly developed a warped sense of humor, yes. This might turn out to be the weirdest ecosystem I've ever seen. And remember, I've seen Quilt. I flipped the pages up and down a few times, then grinned at her. Shades of Flash Gordon, this could be fun. Bridget laughed in reply. I've asked Mario to create us a full space station and auto factory in the system. While he's on that, I'll use his spy drones to get some prelims. We'll have to do a lot of research on this one. Maybe even more than with the Quinlans. Wow. I shook my head in disbelief. Flying monkeys. Not monkeys. Close enough. I closed the window. This is going to be your biggest blog subject ever. 20. Moving on. Bob, August 2334, Misty Falls. We'll need to look in your trunk, sir, one of the cops said to me. I stood frozen for a second, trying to decide if I should make a break for it. Teresa's voice cut through the silence.
Why, in particular, would you need to see the contents of my trunk, officer?
He turned to her, surprise on his face. Your trunk? She gave him an arch look.
Do I look like I can carry that thing around on my own? I've paid him 2 coppers to port her for me. If you keep us too long, the captain will have to delay departure.
And you are?
I am Teresa Sikorsky, late of the University of Peachland.
The cop stepped back, abashed, and I couldn't blame him. This was the first I'd heard that Teresa had a family name, and a well-known one, apparently. That she hadn't thrown it in Snidely's face showed an amazing level of restraint. But meanwhile, the cops were almost falling over themselves trying to placate her. She gave them a sniff and gestured imperiously for me to follow. As we marched away, I muttered to her, "You could have left him some fur." She laughed and stopped.
Let that be my parting gift to you, Inoki. I hope I might someday learn more of your world, and of my world, for that matter. Goodbye.
I said goodbye and headed quickly down the nearest street, trying not to choke up. I had a whole 6 irons in pay from my time on the Hurricane. With the 2 still in my stomach, I was a wealthy man. Okay, not man, Quinlan. Okay, not wealthy either. I could survive for a few days if I had to pay for a hotel. Like it or not, I was going to have to get back on a boat quickly. But I couldn't go back to the dock now. The cops would certainly remember me and the trunk. I could change my appearance, but not the trunk. Or could I? I tried to remember where the shipping office was. I'd seen it out of the corner of my eye as we left the port area. Quickly, I played back the video archive until I found it. I headed back toward the dock, taking the long way around so that the shipping office would be between me and the cops, assuming they were still maintaining watch. On the way, I gradually changed my appearance, using features from random pedestrians to produce a mashup that shouldn't resemble any one individual. I just hoped I was getting it right. I couldn't take out my spider to get a selfie. If people screamed and turned away, I'd have to start over. As hoped, the shipping office sold shipping containers. At 1 iron apiece, they weren't expensive or high quality, but the idea wasn't high security. It was to hide the contents. A row of eyelets around the lid allowed the user to essentially tie it shut, as with a shoelace. It was good enough. The clerk wanted to sell me postage as well, but I initially demurred since I would be traveling with the package. Still, it was probably better to do things the normal way. Finally, I paid the 3 irons, then filled in the tag with just my name and Garek's spine. But I insisted that I would deliver the box to an appropriate boat.
Knock yourself out,
he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. I headed back to the dock, shipping container held awkwardly in both hands, and stopped at the dockmaster's office. "Good day, sir," I said to the person at the counter. "Could you tell me if any ships heading down river are looking for deckhands?" Counter guy glanced at the container in my hands with a frown.
Deckhands? Or postal run?"
"Both. I have a package that I have to send downriver as well. Killing 2 fish with 1 spear. Doesn't have to be the same boat." He nodded, satisfied, and gave me a couple of names. Explanation notwithstanding, I wasn't going to put Bender on a different vessel. I had to hope the boat looking for help would also take an extra shipping container. I thanked him and headed for the indicated berth. The Clipper was somewhat less barge-like than the Hurricane had been. It even had a below-deck area fit for habitation, if you didn't mind crouching a little. It also appeared to be in a state of chaos. People were running around while the captain screamed orders with the same volume and enthusiasm as Lisa's best work. I watched for about 5 seconds, simply absorbing the frenetic energy. I waved at one of the deckhands, and he slowed down to acknowledge me, but didn't come to a complete stop. Definitely stressed, I walked along with him. "I was told you need a deckhand."
"You think? What's the box?"
"A parcel. I've paid postage."
"Whatever. Put it with the postage. Items on deck. Standard pay. See that pile of crates goes over there. Get to work."
I was left opening and closing my mouth for a moment, wondering when I'd get to present my sales pitch. Reluctantly accepting victory, I placed my box in the postal pile, then jumped to work, grabbing boxes and lugging them up the gangplank. They were heavy, and there were a lot of them, but the Manny was more than up to the task. I had to dive into the water twice to cool off, but everyone else was doing the same, as usual. In short order, I had the pallet moved. "Next," I said to the same deckhand, who turned out to be the foreman. With a pleased expression, he pointed to another pile of boxes. About 2 hours later, it began to look like we were catching up. I did a quick cooling dunk, then joined the other deckhands. The foreman slapped me on the shoulder.
"Good work. I hope you can keep up that level of energy. It looks like we're going to be short-handed."
"Why's that?" I asked.
"Cops came by and arrested 2 of our crew for no reason I could see. Took their personal effects, too. It's supposed to be just for 1 night, but we can't wait. We have performance clauses on this shipment, so we're leaving by dusk if the captain has to row the boat himself."
"Which explains why he seemed excited," I replied. Foreman guy laughed.
"Yeah, excited. That's what we call it. He used some threats I've never heard before. I think he was saving them for today."
I grinned. "I'm Sam Oops, I almost gave myself a last name again. Nope, didn't need the notoriety." My faux pas didn't register, though, or maybe the translation software hadn't passed it on. The foreman, whose name was Ralph, introduced the team just as the captain started up with another tirade.
"Time to cast off, people,"
Ralph said, rolling his eyes in the captain's direction. We got back to work, aided by more of the captain's helpful suggestions. I did notice that those suggestions tended to be anatomically related. This guy ran a theme, I guess. The duties on the Clipper were generally the same as on the Hurricane, with a few extra tweaks since it was a bigger boat and a full-on catamaran design. We moved a few items below decks on Ralph's orders and checked the sails once more, and we were done until the next time the captain's head exploded. I'd almost tripped on several occasions over a quartet of Quinlans who had parked their butts in the middle of the deck. A few choice words from Ralph, and they found a more out-of-the-way location. Now that I had the time to actually look at them, I realized they were probably a Sabbat. It was odd that they'd be paying for passage when we weren't going through a connector or segment boundary, where the turbulence could get uncomfortable and tiring to fight. "Hi, all," I said, holding up a hand. "I'm Sam, lately out of a Sabbat myself. We just went our own ways a couple of weeks ago."
"Hello, Sam,"
replied one of the group.
"I'm Tina, and these are Fred, Tony, and Barb. We're looking to homestead. We'll be jumping as soon as we see a good spot."
"Starting your own town?"
"Nothing so ambitious. We want to get away from towns altogether. Don't need them. The fishing is good. This isn't one of the cold segments, and a nest is easier to make and maintain. And we won't have to worry about the juniors getting into trouble.
So you're going back to the wild?
Pretty much. Don't need the rest of it. Counting irons to see if you're ahead, you know?
Yeah, I replied. I do, kind of. You aren't the first group I've run into that's doing this either. She smiled in reply, and I glanced at the other three. None of them seemed inclined to chime in. It was unsettling. This was an intelligent species devolving almost right in front of my eyes. Tina and I talked about inconsequential things for a bit until Tony suddenly declared, "Food time," and slipped over the edge of the boat. The others joined him, Tina giving me an apologetic shrug before leaving. I settled myself on the deck to get a bit of sun, following the sailors' tradition of resting whenever possible. A couple of the other deckhands joined me after glancing at the captain, who was ignoring us for the moment. A few minutes later, the members of the Sabbat pooted onto the deck and settled down with their catch. It was a comfortable, drowsy, idyllic interlude, something I hadn't gotten anywhere near enough of since the Starfleet issue started. If I'd still been bio, I'd have drifted off to sleep. Some of my coworkers seemed to be doing exactly that. Tina had mentioned cold segments. That was interesting. Tina, have you ever been in a cold segment?
No, but my dad lived in one for a while. It snowed sometimes, and there was ice on some of the streams. I've never seen snow or ice. Hard water, right? Weird. Different fish, too, and some other plants and animals that are different.
She thought for a moment.
Dad used to tell stories of segments that had other oddities as well. There was supposed to be one that was mostly water with only islands sticking up here and there. Another one was dry, and the river actually disappeared under the land. I don't know how much to believe, and how much was Da trying to scare us when we were juniors.
I don't think your Da was making it up,
Ralph volunteered.
I've heard of segments with different climates. They always have different plant and animal life. Whether the plants and animals came first or the different climate came first, I don't know.
I started to wish I'd paid more attention to Bridget's conversations with Quinlan's and the theories she'd discussed. This had the feel of a discussion of evolution based on the mistaken idea that Heaven's River was a natural environment. And deism was replacing history in regard to the administrator. Top that off with the Back to Nature movement and a possible loss of sapience. And the Quinlans were in peril of ceasing to exist as an intelligent species, possibly within as little as a few more generations. Was it time for the Bob to get involved? Did I dare start stirring the pot again? And was it a good idea while I was still in country and vulnerable? I could just blow up the Manny and return to Vert if I got in trouble, but Bender didn't have that option. I'd finally managed to get everyone together for a meeting. Hugh was parked in Will's beanbag chair, but the rest of the expedition members were present in floating video windows. I just finished describing the latest conversation with fellow deckhands and passengers.
I think you're correct, Bob. It's going that way. Although maybe not as quickly as you fear.
Bridget crossed her arms, a distinctly worried expression on her face, which clashed with her mildly reassuring phrasing.
I don't know if it matters,
Hugh replied.
How long it'll take. I mean, the takeaway is that it will happen if nothing changes. I don't think we can refuse to deal with this.
I gazed at him, head cocked. I still hadn't had a chance to bring up the whole question of the administrator's true status and Hugh's true motivations. How would he play this? And how would you suggest we do that? Will asked.
Contact the administrator. Talk to them. They may not realize what's happening.
Maybe once Bender is safe, I said. Not until. That's not negotiable. And anyway, what makes you think they don't know? Hugh's brows knit together as he glanced at me.
Seriously? You think they'd want that?
Depends on what the administrator's motivations are. Maybe they'd consider a non-sentient but living Quinlan race better than a sentient but always on the edge of extinction version. Like a perverse instantiation, you know? Now Hugh was all but glaring at me, his eyes narrowed. At that moment, I think we understood each other. I might have just blown any element of surprise, but on the other hand, it might force a reaction of some kind. It seemed a worthwhile trade-off. Certainly there's no reason not to try. Bill spoke into the silence. Once Bender is safe, as you say, We can just start broadcasting radio from all our drones, or send in a spider to dance in front of a camera. Either they'll investigate and open a dialogue, or they'll blow up our devices. We'll know better once they've set the tone.
And what if they do? 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 And what if they do?